Hello, welcome to the Jacksonville History Show. I'm Emily Rutherford-Liska, and this is the show that celebrates and analyzes Jacksonville's history. And we're with a favorite guest today and the godfather of Jacksonville history, Dr. Wayne Wood. Hello and welcome, Wayne.
Emily, it's always great to be on your show. Thank you.
And it's always great to have you because I get back to sit back, relax, and enjoy. And as so many people enjoy the history you present of really an incomparable part of our nation right here in Jacksonville, Florida, and surrounds. North Florida's history is an amazing one, and you've told it in such brilliant fashion time after time. And I think you've really topped yourself lately. In fact, I know you have, because within days of each other, through the Jacksonville Historical Society, you have shepherded, you have guided us with two publications, and they're just brilliant. The first is The Broward Family in Florida, and the Broward family from France to Florida, I apologize. And we'll be talking about that first, and then it'll be followed by The Gift of Public Service, and we'll get to that in a minute. But this is, I'm going to let them zoom in on this wonderful, wonderful volume because the cover itself is a work of art, Wayne.
Well, books are a wonderful way to share our city's history with a wide audience that not only becomes a reference book, but also a source of entertainment and education. And I've just enjoyed doing books. When I was a kid, I always liked to write, and I thought maybe someday I'd be a writer. It turned out I became an optometrist. But in school, I realized that if I could be a good optometrist, I would have plenty of time to write books. And so I believe this is my 11th or 12th book we've just come out with, and I'm looking forward to doing a lot more. This book has been a labor of love. Bob Broward is a dear friend of mine, and he started work on this book over a half a century ago, and it was my privilege to take the manuscript that he'd put together, compiling his family's history, and to make it into a beautiful book published by the Jacksonville Historical Society. So if we might go to our images here, let's just go ahead and take a look inside the book and take a little tour of the Broward family over a period of hundreds of years. If you can focus on the book, we'll dive right into it. The cover of the book, by the way, was a compilation of many, many images. Mike Barnhart, the brilliant artist, did the cover for us. And as we go back and look at the Broward family, it goes back almost 1,000 years. We've been able to trace it back to France. These were French Huguenots who fled France in the 1600s to come to America to get rid of the religious persecution. And it's about 1760 when the Broward, or Brouards as they were called in France, came to the United States and landed in Charleston and made their way to Florida, that Spanish province that was a wild and woolly place, vast swampland that hardly anybody would want to come to. But the Spanish governor sweetened the deal by saying, if you'll come down here and settle, we'll give you hundreds of acres of land. And Francois Broward, later known as Francis Broward, came here about 1800 and settled and started what has become one of the largest and most historic families in the state of Florida. Francois Broward's son, John Broward, got not only 200 or 300 acres of land, but he built a sawmill which the Spanish governor would then give you 16,000 acres if you would build a sawmill, which was badly needed in this wilderness colony. And with that 25 square miles of territory in North Jacksonville, he built this fabulous house called Cedar Villa, one of the largest houses in East Florida at that time, while it was owned by Spain. And gradually the Browards acquired lots of property, taking over the area roughly from the Jacksonville Zoo to the airport to the Duval County line, and most of the property all the way to Fort George Island. They became the largest property owner in this area. And one of the buildings they built still exists in ruins. It is Cedar Point Plantation on Black Hammock Island, not too far from Fort George Island, the ruins of which still exist. So this family's history goes back decades and decades, over centuries and centuries, really. And not only were they early pioneers, but they've been very much part of the fabric of Florida history. One of the Broward daughters actually sewed the first Florida flag of secession when Florida seceded from the United States during the Civil War. And the grandsons of Francois Broward were very prominent in the Civil War. You had Napoleon Broward, you had Pulaski Broward, Charles Broward, and Lafayette Montgomery Broward, some of those having very French-sounding names. And there's a wonderful part of the Broward book talking about their exploits in the Civil War. We actually have a 23-page diary telling actually what happened each day during 5 of the major battles of the Civil War they were involved in. And going into the 1920s, we see a picture of the old Cedar Point plantation here with the great-great-grandson of Mr. Broward on the left. That's Pulaski Broward. In the middle is a young boy who later became Bob Broward, one of our city and nation's famous architects, standing in front of this city ruin. As Bob grew up in Jacksonville and studied his family history, he inherited a love of this old plantation ruins, the family history, which he studied through hundreds of letters which he inherited from these old family members who were here in the very beginning of time, before Jacksonville was a city and before Florida was a state. And as he embarked on his architectural career, always in the back of his mind was this rich family history, and he set about in the 1940s beginning to research and write the book which we have now published for the Jacksonville Historical Society. It is filled with many rich characters, and you'll have to read the book to hear all of these stories, but we have wonderful photographs going back showing some of the early members of the family. Here you see Washington Turner, who is the brother of Lem Turner. They were neighbors of the Browards, and he married a woman named Lizzie, and Washington was murdered during the Civil War, and one of the Browards came along and married her. And later on, she died, and this man, Pulaski Broward, put an ad in the New York Times for his second wife, and married this woman who was 35 years his junior. I mean, the Broward family is just filled with characters and wonderful stories that you'll see illuminated in this book. Another one of the great characters was Lafayette Broward, Montgomery Broward, who wrote the Civil War diary we just spoke about. And because Jacksonville's area was not very well populated, he wound up marrying his cousin, who in turn had a wonderful many Broward relatives. All the Browards seemed to have 8, 10, and 11 children. They had 8, 10, and 11 children, and that's how it quickly became one of the most populous families in the whole state of Florida. One of the great-grandchildren was a man named Napoleon Bonaparte Broward. Gosh, in my research, we came at least 9 or 10 Napoleon Bonaparte Browards. They loved these names, and they kept naming each other over and over again. But he became one of the most famous members of the family, and that he ran guns to Cuba during the Spanish-American War on his boat known as the Three Friends. And he became quite popular and well known as a local hero, and went on to become elected governor of the state of Florida. He had a big campaign and became governor, inaugurated in Tallahassee, and became one of Florida's most important governors and very influential in changing the state to become a modern entity. And he actually built the governor's mansion utilizing his friend Henry John Clutho, the famous architect from Jacksonville, and built the governor's mansion, which was torn down in recent years for a more modern building. But he was quite the character and spent the remainder of his days out at Fort George Island in this house, which still exists and is part of the Timucuan Preserve as part of the National Park Service. And it was here that he died. After his governorship, he ran for Senate and got elected, but died before he could take office. So he was one of the more famous and colorful members of the Broward family, and there are many things named after him. Broward County, the Napoleon Bonaparte Broward Bridge, a.k.a. the Dana's Point Bridge, as well as dormitories at the University of Florida and so on. So Bob Broward, who is recognized as one of Florida and America's most important modern architects, studied with Frank Lloyd Wright and left a legacy not only in his architecture, but in these wonderful books that he's written. And now we'll talk a little bit about
I told you I would sit back and relax, and I was also enthralled. Wonderful. who would not want the book after hearing your synopsis? A famous family. Now we want to talk about another notable Jacksonville resident, and this is Fred Schultz. His book, The Gift of Public Service, was published only days, guided by you again, Dr. Wood.
Fred Schultz was one of Jacksonville's most important modern civic leaders, and although people know about him, they don't really know his full story, which was an amazing career of public service for our city. And so this book is well overdue. Unfortunately, Fred died a couple of years ago before the book could be published, but this book is a lasting tribute to him. And it was basically his story. It was told to John Young, a Unitarian minister and a friend of his, and I took the manuscript that John Young wrote and made it into this book. Fred started out as a rich kid. He grew up in Avondale and was an outrageous character from the very get-go. And his daddy owned a bus line that grew into become Greyhound bus lines, and that's where his family got his wealth. But as Fred grew up, he became an entrepreneur and turned the family fortune into an even greater fortune, which he became a great philanthropist. But as Fred grew up, he went to Bowles School. He was a kid who was always ahead of his time, always into trouble. He was a party boy in school, but just brilliant and charismatic. And so even in his elementary and high school days, he was quite the leader. And as he went off to school and went to Princeton, and he thought about going to law school and other things, but wound up coming back to Jacksonville and becoming an entrepreneur. And he was an important leader when the 1960 civil rights riots broke out. He was one of those who helped to solve the problem by bringing the white community into the solution rather than being part of the problem. So he has a career as a civil rights leader. He went on to work with the Chamber of Commerce. He became elected to the House of Representatives. He decided to not only be a business person, but to get into politics. And he quickly rose and became the Speaker of the House of Representatives, and probably was the most important single Speaker of the House in modern history, in that he totally changed the Constitution. He battled and solved the problem of reapportionment. He revised the Constitution and was a champion of education in the state of Florida, and became a very popular leader for our state, bringing it into the 20th century. At the same time that he was Speaker of the House, John Matthews, also from Jacksonville, was the president of the Senate. So these two men together really did an amazing role in changing Florida to the modern state that it has now become, and hopefully will continue to be. After serving as Speaker of the House for 2 terms, he then decided to run for the Senate, the United States Senate in Washington, D.C., which he lost to a man named Lawton Childs, who later on became one of his great friends. But that lesson in humility is a very important part of his story and part of the book. His family is a wonderful family that somehow endured this man running for politics and running at businesses, and grew up brilliantly, and he adores his family. And the interaction between a man who is so busy and involved in politics and yet his love for his family is a wonderful part of the story about how they interacted with him and how he with them. And Fred was not only a jocular and entertaining man, very charismatic, but he also had a little bit of a dark side, which he admitted himself, and it is told in this book that will, I think, be a revelation to many people. But he was an entrepreneur of the highest order. He bought and sold many companies. He was on the board of directors of many national companies and brought them up. He was very prominent in the Barnett Bank. He helped to revise the Chamber of Commerce. He later got appointed to the Federal Reserve Board and served as vice chairman of the Federal Reserve Board with Paul Volcker during one of the greatest economic crises in American history. And he was truly a national hero. And he went on to come back to Jacksonville and lead his life as a philanthropist. The Cummer Museum was one of his chief endowments. He led capital campaigns for the University of North Florida. In fact, he invented the University of North Florida. He and John Matthews passed the legislation that enabled FCCJ and the University of North Florida, and the Schultz Center at UNF, one of the preeminent teacher education programs in the United States, is still there as a lasting legacy of this truly amazing Jacksonville citizen, Fred Schultz.
Wayne, thank you for that, and thank you for all of your work to bring both of these books to not just Jacksonville, but Florida and the nation, because these books are of national interest as well. I just want to remind everyone before we take a little break here, I'm here with Dr. Wayne Wood, who's been responsible for more than 12 books, a dozen books on area history and beyond. I want to thank you for being here, but we're going to come back and we're going to do a little bit more. For now, anybody who wants to get these books, they can contact the Jacksonville Historical Society, and we'll be back in just a minute more with Dr. Wayne Wood, Jacksonville's historian.